Hello, my name is Courtney Radsch. I am a fellow at the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy and a U.S. advisor on technology for Article 19, the Global Freedom of Expression Organization, as well as a host of other affiliations. I'm here today really delighted to be moderating this critical debate that's coming at a time when we know that people on the ground in Russia and Ukraine are facing really horrific actions after an illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine as bombs are falling. There is nonetheless a really important debate that has emerged as part of this discussion over whether or not to sanction internet access and the role that sanctions at the infrastructure level of the internet should play when there are instances of violent conflict or illegal international war, or other sorts of uses of the internet infrastructure layer to put up barriers to communication to countries or entities that are engaged in illegal acts or sanctioned by the international community. So we are here today to discuss the internet infrastructure and how it has, I think for the most part, been seen as kind of off limits, although I think we're going to debate that. But now with the invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing that internet governance organizations are now split over this, that the internet governance community is increasingly exploring, whether or not we should be considering sanctions at the internet infrastructure level, especially after we've seen many services at the so-called application or content level of the internet, social media platforms, cloud services, et cetera, denying access to Russian entities. So this is a very timely debate. I want to thank, we have a really excellent panel here set up of experts who kind of explore the range of perspectives on this issue, including Bill Woodcock, the executive director at the Packet Clearinghouse, Andrew Sullivan, president of Internet Society, Farzaneh Badii, founder of Digital Medusa, and Yik-Chan, professor from Beijing Normal University. I regret that we were unable to get the video from Svitlana Matvitenko, an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. As I was saying, Svitlana was unable to join us today as she is in Ukraine and was unable to send a video message. So with that, before we get into the debate, I want to kind of give folks a sense of where our panelists sit on this issue of internet sanctions at the infrastructure level. So before we get into the why, I'm just going to ask them each to tell us their perspective. Should we be considering sanctions at the internet infrastructure layer? Bill? Yes or no, or maybe?
It's a legal obligation. It's not really a question that we need to answer.
Okay. Andrew?
No.
Farzaneh?
No, we should provide relief for sanctioned countries.
Yik-Chan? You're going to have to unmute yourself.
Right. I think for me, it's maybe answer depends on which part of the internet and who issued the sanction.
Great. All right. So we realize this is going to be a complicated debate, but I want to give everyone a sense of kind of where the panelists sit before we delve into the details. So with that, I want to first turn to Bill Woodcock. As I mentioned, he's the executive director at the Packet Clearinghouse, which is an international non-governmental organization that builds and supports critical internet infrastructure, including the internet exchange points and the core of the domain name system. So Bill, you spearheaded a proposal to calling for the creation of a mechanism that could technically blacklist individual Russian military and propaganda websites that would essentially use the same basic technology used to combat spam, malware, phishing, DDoS attacks, et cetera. And I gather what this would necessitate is getting together and publishing a list of sanctioned IP addresses and domain names that telecommunication providers or other network operators could subscribe to. And so I'd like to hear from you first a bit about what exactly is the proposal here. You had, I think, more than 40 experts from the internet governance community sign on to the document, which you described as the beginning of a global internet governance conversation about kind of the appropriate scope of sanctions, the feasibility of sanctions within the realm of our collective responsibility, and our moral imperative to minimize detrimental consequences. So tell us more about what is it that you're proposing and why?
So sanctions are things that governments impose and require the private sector to implement. And there's a problem when people in the private sector try to get out ahead of government and do what they think government is going to ask them to do in advance of an actual legal request, particularly because, most of the people in the internet business have approximately zero experience with sanctions from either side. And, we have some exceptions here on the panel, which is great. But, most of the people who are responsible for making compliance and routing decisions on global backbone networks are not people who have any background in this field. But governments collectively have 2,500 years of continuous experience implementing sanctions. And there's a lot of fairly nuanced theory about how to do it in ways that are not diminishing human rights, ways that are more or less effective at achieving different kinds of goals. All this is an area in which there is a whole lot of accumulated expertise, and we don't have it. What we do have is each a legal responsibility to obey the law in whatever country we're based in. And so I believe that the meeting of minds that needs to happen here is between network operators who have an understanding of the technical implementation of filtering that happens millions of times, tens of millions of times every day right now for other reasons, with sanctions experts in government who are defining what the sanctions that have to be implemented, complied with are, so that both sides can learn from each other and we can avoid the uncertainty that creates a chilling effect that in turn leads to private sector network operators over sanctioning, over complying, which is a human rights problem and detrimental to the policy goals that the sanctions are supposed to implement in the first place.
So if I understand you correctly, you're essentially saying you want government, and by I assume here you mean the US government, which is the one that has imposed sanctions, and or European governments on Russia, to provide guidance to the private sector on how to impose sanctions on the internet so that it would prohibit Russian military.
Not exactly. I mean, network operators don't need to know how to filter things, right? As I said, network operators are doing that tens of millions of times every day already. What is needed is clear communication about what the targets of the sanctions are. That I think, in the private sector, we have this very, very naive conception of sanctions that pretty much equates to what is called comprehensive sanctions, which is not really a thing and hasn't really been a thing for 2 generations. What in the real world sanctions are at this point are targeted sanctions, which are against a specific individual or a specific military unit or a specific producer of a weapon component or a specific ship or a specific airplane or a specific building. And to the degree that those can be matched up to specific IP addresses or domain names, there is compliance that can happen. But if government doesn't understand which of these things map to internet resources, and the private sector doesn't understand what the focus of the sanction is supposed to be, that miscommunication is leading to over-sanctioning, or rather over-compliance, and that in turn has humanitarian consequences.
Great. Thank you for clarifying, Bill. We will definitely get to some of the things that you said. I'm going to want to hear from Farzaneh about this idea that we have gotten better at imposing targeted sanctions. But before I go to that question, I want to go to Andrew, who is the president of the Internet Society, otherwise known as ISOC, and is essentially fundamentally opposed to this idea. You've said that these proposals miss something fundamental about the internet, that it was never designed to respect country borders. And the idea of unplugging a country is as wrong when people want to do it to another country as it is when governments want to do it to their own. And indeed, we've seen in these big campaigns, Keep It On, et cetera, designed to push back against using kind of raw access, internet infrastructure layer access issues within countries that are experiencing uprisings or protest movements, et cetera, and you're kind of likening these. Tell us why, from your perspective, do you see the idea of infrastructure level internet sanctions as so problematic?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me today. The reason we're concerned about this, and the reason I'm so concerned about it, is because the network of networks, the internet, depends on all of these individual networks to interoperate with one another. And if you try to interfere in the neutral, that sort of, kind of lowest level, just pure technical interoperation of that, and you try to bring in a lot of other policy considerations to that kind of connectivity, very quickly what happens is the mere fact of connectivity becomes a political football. And having opened that door, what we will find is we're well down the path to splintering the internet. And that is not, people talk about this as, oh, well, we'll have these different spheres of influence internets. There's this op-ed that came out a couple of years ago about the American internet and the European one and the Chinese one. And the problem with this idea is that isn't the internet at all. What you then have are three separate online services that don't interoperate with one another, or else you have a massively complicated system to get them to interoperate with one another once again, and that massively complicated thing is just a new layer of the internet. Those are really the possibilities. So the objection that I have boils down to the question of whether it is possible to do this in an effective way. And I think it's an error on the part. I completely agree with Bill that governments are going to impose such sanctions as they like. And I completely agree that the internet knows how to do filtering. Like, there's lots and lots of filters on the internet and they all work fine. What I'm concerned about is the idea that we will contribute to the myth that there is a tech fix to this kind of problem so that we can create a technical layer where sanctions can plug in effectively. Either the sanctions will not be effective or they will not be targeted. And either one of those is bad for the internet. And so my view is that the internet is a very valuable tool of human interconnection. It's a very valuable tool for human development. And it's especially a very valuable tool for those who don't agree with whatever regime they happen to be living underneath. And for that reason, it is something that we ought to work very hard to preserve. My concern really about these sanctions, particularly at the level of the internet infrastructure, explicit sanctions at the level of the internet infrastructure. I'm just setting aside the accidental effects of the sanctions we already have. That it will fundamentally undermine the internet in a kind of permanent way, and that is a very dangerous step for us to take. And that's the reason I'm so opposed.
So to press you on that, why is it so dangerous? What does that actually look like? Because to some extent you're saying, okay, well, you would need to add a new layer, and it's already layers and layers of networks. So what's one new network layer if it could get to, I think what Bill is saying, what he would see in some governments see as legitimate need on the end of some. So what is the ultimate danger? Like, what does that end up looking like for people trying to access the internet?
One of the reasons the internet has been such a source of creativity and development is that it doesn't have a lot of central control built into it. It's highly distributed in the way that it operates. And what this means is that if you can get some kind of transit and you can connect to a few other people. You can do a lot of things yourself. The idea that there will be a central registry of people that we're allowed to talk to goes entirely against that entire idea. But if it's not a central registry of people that we're allowed to talk to, and it's instead just like a bunch of people make up all of their various lists, then it's not sanctions. It's just like, consumer boycott or something like that. And this is not a sort of trivial semantic difference that we're talking about. For one of these cases, you go to jail or get fined heavily if you violate it. For the other case, maybe your friends don't like you. Those are different categories of operation, and I think we need to keep that very much in mind. If it's not an official list of, these are the officially allowed to be connected people to the internet, then it's not a sanctions regime, and it's not one that is really enforceable. But if we give people this official list of who you're allowed to talk to, different governments of the world are not going to agree with one another about what that list is. And very quickly, what we will find is that different spheres of government are going to implement these things quite differently. They're going to have different acceptability lists. And in no time at all, we will find that we are solitudes who can't talk to each other. And I think that that's a terrible thing for humanity.
Thank you, Andrew. With that, I want to turn to Farzaneh now. Farzaneh, you are the founder of Digital Medusa, and you and I work on several kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives related to content moderation, terrorism, et cetera, which is another issue that involves sanctions and sanctions lists, et cetera. You are both an expert in internet governance, and you have personal experience with the impact of sanctions and the lived experience given the long U.S. sanctions-led regime on Iran. You have called the idea of imposing infrastructure-level sanctions on Russia revenge fantasy, and noted that the tendency for companies to overcomply with sanctions as a general principle could have a devastating effect on ordinary people's access to the internet, while not having the optimal deterrent outcome. And I would also note that there is someone in the chat from Iran who noted that, Razia is experiencing this, the internet blackout and internet sanctions against Iran as a real person who is already suffering from other forms of repression by their government. And you've said that people need to rethink the sanction regime for the internet to keep the internet global and open and facilitate the free flow of information. So it sounds like you're more on the side of Andrew, but I want you to address this. And also, I think Bill implicitly indicated that there are many instances of sanctions regimes working, and yet I would say that those of us who have lived, worked, and studied in the so-called global South might not have the same experience with that. So Farzaneh, why don't you, bring us in on, inform us about your perspective on this?
Sure. Thank you, Courtney. First of all, let me be clear that when we talk about the sanctioned countries are usually led by authoritarian regimes. And they also, the ordinary people in those countries also suffer from dictatorship. But then we impose sanctions globally, and we want to do targeted sanctions, which in some industry it might be possible, and sanctioning oligarchs and dictators that actually undertake terrorist activities in other in countries. Then I think that that's something to think about and see if it has been effective to prevent them from doing so. Unfortunately, on the internet, and I'm only talking about the internet, that's my thing. So let me tell you what we faced as ordinary people in Iran. And it's not only a matter of Iran. There is Syria, there is also North Korea, there's Venezuela, Cuba for a long time suffered from these sanctions. And there are a bunch of others, like there's Somalia and Sudan. I don't want to, the list is long. Unfortunately, when we when we live in countries that are sanctions, and we need to talk about what sort of sanctions. There are economic sanctions, there are trade sanctions, and the governments, and the U.S. government especially, has a lot of experience in that. They have been trying different ways to be able to sanction the regime, the ruling government, and also not to affect the ordinary people. But when it came to the internet, I remember that in the beginning of, like in mid 2000, we couldn't, Iranians could not access Google Talk because Google did not want to provide its services because of the sanctions that were applied, and also the tech companies overcomplied with these sanctions and didn't want to deal with a country that even like remotely had those rules imposed on. And so then there was the office of, during Obama administration, they came up with a general OFAC license. A general license that would allow the tech companies to provide services, to provide communication and personal services to ordinary people who are not on the special designated national lists. And so, as you can see, the government themselves are struggling with getting it right and with getting it targeted. That general license was great. It allowed us, the Iranians and people in sanctioned countries to have access to communication apps and other services. But they were very much affected, and they are still affected. The domain names, I have mentioned and written about it. We have been struggling with a domain name confiscation for the mere fact that you are a resident of a sanctioned country, or you're providing services to sanctioned countries. And I don't know how you can make that targeted and effective. This is not a matter of atrocity that is going on in Ukraine and Russia invasion of Ukraine, which I condemn. And it's it has brought up this issue, but this is what we have been dealing with, what sanctioned countries have been dealing with for a long time. And the effect of that is very obvious. And I don't know how and why some experts believe that they can do effective and targeted sanctions, why they have not been able to do so. We have sanction at even with the general license, we have sanction at the infrastructure level. It has affected us already at the domain name level, the internet protocol allocation. They cannot allocate protocols anymore, and also we have to sort those issues out. We also have problems with the content delivery networks and peering. Our network operators in Iran in sanctioned countries have a lot of problems. So I don't know how or why we can do targeted sanctions. And if we are talking about boycotts and like a bunch of companies and private sector got together and want to sanction certain like military agencies, then that's something that I'm going to respond to, like I'm going to discuss later on. But we need to, as Andrew said, we need to get the terms right. What we're talking about, are we talking about boycott or sanction? I can comment on that later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Farzaneh. I think that's really important. One of the things I'm taking away from what you said is there is an example already, numerous examples, but to take Iran, where there are infrastructure level sanctions in place, and that nonetheless has not had the intended outcome that I think the countries that put those sanctions in place would have liked. And, just put in from my own experience, I did my doctoral research in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt and Lebanon in the lead up to the Arab Spring. And I just keep wondering, what would have happened if we, if the world had kind of gotten together and said, hey, let's put sanctions on Egypt and Tunisia, internet infrastructure level sanctions because they were, killing their people in the streets during the uprisings. I think that would have been, really detrimental. But let me turn now to Yik-Chan, who I think brings a really interesting perspective, because clearly this is all political. And when we're talking about, wanting to impose sanctions, we're talking about a certain geopolitical gathering of countries. And obviously we've seen that there continues to be a lack of consensus at the international level about what type of sanctions should be put on Russia. And of course, this is just the latest conflict where this comes up. And so, Yik-Chan, you're a professor at Beijing Normal University. China has been the target of other types of US sanctions. It also has, it seems, a certain resiliency in that it has created kind of its own intranet, which is something that we know Russia has been aiming to do as well. And, I'd like to see from your perspective, sitting a little bit more outside of this debate that, and tell me if maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like this debate is very much over like Western, the kind of Western consensus, and Russia and Beijing is sitting in a different location. So talk to us about some of the dynamics at play there. And I do want to recognize there's a lot of comments in the chat, and I'm going to be coming to those and pulling those in once we hear from Yik-Chan. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Courtney and others for inviting me. And I think basically the Chinese situation is different from Russia in some way. First of all, there's no sanction towards China in terms of infrastructure level, okay? And there's sanction towards China's telecom company like Huawei or the other telecom company, and that's a entity list proposed by the US government. And of course, China has a great framework, which is filtering the website, and also the other, the other company, the website in the West or the overseas, they also blocked, access from China occasionally. So I just want to make a clarification about that. And so the situation is that I think many technical communities, especially technical communities in China, and also the internet governance academics in China, is quite concerned about these sanctions, and also the disconnection, by the technical company, especially the ISPs, so like a tier one, big technical company, they disconnect from the Russians' access to global infrastructure. So my position is that actually I think the sanction may be allowed, because there's two reasons. First of all, I want to clarify it. When we talk about internet, there's different layers. That's what we call the public core, the critical infrastructure and the critical resources, which we call the public core. And beside, on top of that, there's a content level and a content layer, and app layers. So I think many organizations like a Global Commission of Cyber Security, Cyber Stability, and also UN, and also OEWG, the Open Working Groups. All of them mentioned that we should maintain the integrity, and the stability of the public core and the critical infrastructure. So in that sense, I think I do not think we should, touch the core, the public core and the critical infrastructure level, which is very crucial for maintaining the stability and the security of the internet as a whole, just like the other colleagues just mentioned. But why I'm thinking there's a possibility for impose sanctions, which could be the economical sanction, and the trade sanction, is because I think if there's a terrorism actions, or there's a really serious violation of human rights, and then probably we should leave this option to an authority. But which is the authority? I think at the moment there's the intensive geographical tension among the different countries, different continents. I think that ultimately it should be raised under the United Nations, because we know there's IGF and they're doing the great work at the moment. They're doing the reform of the IGF. And there's the OEWG as well, open working group on the security of the internet communication technology. So we need a kind of infrastructure, even the UN's Security Council, which is may not be supported, recognized as workable at the moment by many of us. So I'm just thinking maybe I just reserve options, and this power to impose sanctions should not be rest on individual country or state, but should be rest on a global institution which we all support or recognized.
Thank you, Yik-Chan. I think what I'm understanding from your perspective is there is a layer of the internet, the critical internet resources that need to be just off limits. But that, there might be other approaches to looking at other levels, but ultimately the discussion of how is this decided is a political one, and where that happens would be really important. I want to acknowledge there's a really robust discussion in the comments, and I want to note that most of the comments seem to express skepticism over the idea that targeted sanctions can work. I want to note Peter Mychek, who is with Access Now, made a comment in response to Farzaneh, noting that overcompliance by tech companies who themselves blame payment providers and credit card companies creates a long tail on sanctions far beyond what's legally allowed under the law. So it's dangerous to push even targeted sanctions because companies won't take the time or energy to comply to the letter of the sanctions. And there's a bunch of comments from people noting that, the idea of target sanctions, they always affect the ordinary people the most. And so if we think about the situation in Russia or any other country that might get targeted by this idea of a sanctions regime, likely emphasizing the impact on ordinary people and affecting them. And so I want to go to you, Bill, to kind of address that question. And then also, if you know anything about the situation in Cuba, because Mike Nelson at Carnegie asks whether the situation in Cuba could teach us anything interesting, because the US has imposed strict sanctions there. But at the same time, the US government now wants to get Cubans connected and help them get access to non-Cuban information sources and their relatives, et cetera. And so wanting to know if the US got it right, to quote Farzaneh. So can you address some of these questions and whether this is an example of what went right?
I think there are a couple of areas in which I and many of the other people who operate internet networks have been very naive and have a lot to learn from governments in this. I think pretty much everyone that I talk to has a vastly inflated notion of what the targeted sanctions actually target. So educating yourself by going and actually reading the sanctions is critical to understanding where things stand. Understanding the difference between what is actually done and what the sanctions say is a big one. My conclusion is that the single largest problem here is overcompliance, and I think we're probably mostly in agreement on that. That people not reading the sanction and, as others have pointed out, not taking the time to implement what's there, but instead doing something more that is not required of them and that is counterproductive, is a big problem. I think also people look at the internet and they don't yet have a conception of how the internet differs from sanctions as imposed through other mechanisms. And I think banking is the one that we're all probably most familiar with. There are two really big differences between internet sanctions and financial sanctions. The first one is that the United Nations does not guarantee a human right to money. It does guarantee a human right to communications and access to information. So your ability to transact with cash, with electronic transfers, whatever, is not something that is guaranteed to you under the internationally recognized human rights. But your access to information in every form is. So that's one big difference. So we can't just say, well, if we cut these folks off, we're not doing them a significant harm, because that's a recognized harm. The second one is extraterritoriality, that banks, you may look at something like HSBC or Citibank and say, that's an international company. That is a company that does business in a lot of different countries. But that's kind of like looking at a McDonald's and saying, that's a company that does business in a lot of places. Those are all franchises. Every single one of those banks is a separate corporation that is separately regulated and is entirely independent of the others. It is responsible to exactly one government, and it has one set of policies that is defined by the government it's responsible to, by the financial regulator it's responsible to. Sure, there are a bunch of other companies doing business under the same brand, and they may share a website, but functionally they are entirely separate, and they each have a unique policy. The internet doesn't work that way, though. The internet, you've got one company, Lumen or NTT, that has a global backbone that's operating in hundreds of countries, and it has a single policy across all those countries. It's one company, and it is incorporated in a country. It is headquartered somewhere, and it is responsible to the laws of that country. So if we take the laws of that country, the sanctions imposed by that country, and they are not uniform, they're not globally harmonized, then we have an extraterritoriality problem in that country's policies are being imposed upon people in other countries, even though those people live in a country under a government that guarantees them freedoms that are not then being respected. This becomes even worse if you have two governments with opposing policies that cannot then be reconciled. So I think we have, number one, this over implementation problem that needs to be overcome. And that is pretty much purely a matter of educating the private sector and keeping them from having to each do the work independently, right? So we've seen this with spam and malware and so forth. There was a period of time in which there were many large networks which simply wouldn't route address space from Nigeria because they were convinced that Nigeria was the source of lots of scams. And so Nigerians had difficulty connecting to big parts of the world. That's overblocking. We fixed that by having a whole lot of experts who compile lists of IP addresses and domain names that are responsible for sending spam and not other stuff. And those get blocked and not other people. That's an imperfect example, but we have other examples from DDoS and malware and other kinds of problems. And these things get blocked tens of millions of times a day. And as Andrew pointed out, that works. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good.
I'm going to go to Andrew in a second, but Yik-Chan, I saw you nodding along with Bill. Did you want to weigh in on this? And also, there's a comment from Amir Mokabari in the comments about the Clean Network Initiative and its impact on deleting China from the internet infrastructure. And so I'm wondering if you're familiar with that and want to address that as well.
Yeah, I think Bill actually there's two different issues. One is, as I said, I strongly against the sanction towards the public core and the critical infrastructure, and critical resource. Of course, we have to debate what should be included as a public core, but already like OEWG and the global GCSE already proposed what should be included, like an IP address and domain name, and also like a backbone, and the encryption regions as well. So those should be protected as a part of the critical infrastructure. And also the UN, they have already the proposal to create the global digital compacts, which also mentioned the public goods, the global public goods. So for example, this IP address and the big data as part of the global public goods, which should be protected as a whole, as a global commons. So this should be protected and should not be subject to sanction. But on top of that, I think there's two issues just Bill mentioned. One is the jurisdiction issues, especially if we look at the Russians case, and there's for example, the Facebook or this social media, when they impose the sanction to block or block lists or filtering those Russian company or medias, and which involve the jurisdiction issues. So because the EU and the American have different law. For example, American have a section 230, which give the ultimately unlimited power to the social media platform to do whatever they think is objectionable content. But where the EU and other countries, Asia countries, they have different law. So this is really the issue we need to sort out if we want to have a sanction at the content layer, or the commercial layer. So we want to block these one commercial company for economical sanctions. So these are the really crucial issue if we really want to have that kind of things. So that's why I agree with Bill in that sense.
Thank you, Yik-Chan. Andrew, I want to turn to you to respond to Bill's point. And then also a question that arises for me is, if we're talking about maybe in the internet way of doing things, maybe not sanctions imposed by a government, but a sanction-like or boycott approach that is multi-stakeholder in its creation, does that pose the same sort of challenges?
I think
I want this to go to Andrew right now. I'll come back to you, Jan. That's okay.
Well, thanks. So, I agree with Bill that a lot of the technical community has been deeply naive about what the sanctions regimes actually say. But I do think actually that the fines are arranged in such a way that they're intended to invoke overcompliance, because the risk is so high, and particularly in U.S. contexts, the risks, the high risk environments tend to make you more conservative and tend to make you over comply with a set of rules, and I think that that's part of the design of these systems, and yet then he points out this fundamental thing that there are policies that can't be reconciled. I think this exactly proves my point, that a global system that is not somehow globally unified, where everybody agrees who should be cut off, turns out to mean that you have to comply with a bunch of different things, and those things potentially, actually, I would say probably, will not be mutually reconcilable. And at that point, what I am arguing is, therefore, we should protect the infrastructure from that sort of thing. That's exactly my point. I do think that the American Clean Network Initiative was a pretty good illustration of why these things can't be effective anyway, because it was a very clear target that you weren't allowed to speak from, quote, American networks to, quote, Chinese networks, whatever in the world that's supposed to mean. And the consequence was people figured out how to connect to intermediate networks that got them there anyway. That's how the internet is designed. And so the fact that this is possible suggests to me that you can't actually do the sanctions in the way that is most effective. And that is part of the reason that I think creating this sort of system is probably not going to work. It's quite another matter, however, to answer your question. It's quite another matter if people want to come up with, Bill and Andrew's list of baddies on the internet that we don't want to connect to. Fine, go ahead, make your list, and people will do that. We have to recognize that there are inevitably going to be people who will not take that list up, who will not implement those filters. And we know that. And in fact, the examples of spam and routing block lists and so on are all examples of this, where we know that it continues to, it's not possible to get universal agreement about this sort of thing. And the result of that, of course, is that it's more expensive for those people, and maybe that is a desideratum, and maybe that's a thing that we want to pursue. But I think it just adds a lot of friction and unnecessarily penalizes, the people who are living under various regimes that I personally don't agree with. It has negative consequences for those people. The sort of overlords of such societies, they already have all the resources. They can afford the additional costs. So the penalty, it seems to me, ends up being paid by the wrong people.
Farzaneh, I would think that you probably agree with Andrew about the penalty being paid by the wrong people. In terms of, what we have learned from Iran, where again, we have this longer example of sanctions being imposed, of companies, trying to figure out how to comply, seeking workarounds, greater guidance, et cetera. And yet, from the perspective of the sanctioning country, the United States, they have not brought around the change which they're looking for. So I want to also ask you, this is coming up in the comments and in some of the things that are written about the idea that we do need to look at internet infrastructure level sanctions, of whether there are red lines that are crossed. For example, someone mentioned, I lost the comment here, but asked, if Putin is using nuclear weapons, does that, change the calculus? But then I would just bring in a thought from, again, like many people have raised in the comments, like where do we decide whose is that red line? We've heard a lot about the implicit and very explicit kind of racism and geopolitics that is involved in how we think about this war on a predominantly white population versus how we've seen reactions to genocide in Xinjiang or to the Syrian war or the US's invasion of Iraq. So how is it even possible to come up with, joint definitions and joint approaches? I mean, you and I work in a lot of groups together where we try to come to consensus, and definitions are always at the root of that. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think, Courtney, you mentioned the red lines are very important, because I think we should think about what are we trying to solve. So what are we trying to do with sanctions? With sanctions, usually sanctions are imposed to make the decision makers of a country poorer and kind of like so that they don't have the financial resources to continue bombing other people and stuff like that. When it comes to the internet, why are we talking about sanctioning the internet? And then that's when we understand where the red lines are. Like, for example, will we stop Putin from using a nuclear weapon by disconnecting, by imposing sanction on the military? Can we achieve that? Can we actually stop the bombing and shelling that is going on in Ukraine now against the communication infrastructure by sanctioning the internet access? And how? I mean, I don't personally think that we can achieve that through the internet infrastructure. And
okay, let me ask you, just to get because I want to bring in Bill comment and to press you a little bit, like if we're talking, if we think it's possible to do targeted sanctions on, say, Russian military and state level resources, does that change the calculus or still no?
If you can, so for what? So that they don't communicate. So do they use the internet to actually bomb and communicate? If they do, then but that is not the case. The military doesn't.
They use it to communicate. They use it for military communication. They
So,
are
and then
in this war.
but then you go out. But now my question is, how do you, like your technical, I want to know how technically and governance wise you are going to do this. Because from the proposal, the statement that I see, technically this is very doubtful that you can actually do targeted sanction and then like stop the military to talk to one another without affecting others. And the other thing is that the governance structure, there is no governance structure in this statement. It has like many flaws. So well, maybe I'm asking Bill now. I don't know, Courtney, do you want to?
I want to bring in Andrew. You mentioned in the you probably also have this perspective. Like, what would actually sanctioning the Russian military network do? And is that even possible, as you say in the comment, that they'll just find other networks to use? Can you expand on that, Andrew?
Sure. I mean, right. What we're talking about in these cases, whether we're talking about the Russian case or, for instance, the case of Iran or any of the other sanctioned places we're talking about, are governments that will cheerfully ignore, even their apparent treaty obligations under various UN commitments and so on. And if that's the case, the chances that they're not going to seize a quote civilian network in order to prosecute their aims, it's zero. And so under those circumstances, you have to cut off every network that speaks to those networks. And as just a practical matter, very quickly, what you're talking about is a complete disjunct set of networks. One network that cannot speak in any sense to the other networks. Under that circumstance, you're losing the internet. That's what that is. It's an attack on the very idea of the internet. Now, I mean, somebody might decide that is okay, that's a useful thing. I come from the internet society. We never think that's an okay thing. But other people might think that's a thing that you could do. But we need to be clear about what it is. The idea of targeting this thing, we get this sort of surgical removal of a particular military network. It just flies in the face of the way networks work, because they are naturally interconnecting.
So, Bill, one of the things that the proposal that you helped spearhead talks about is creating a multi-stakeholder mechanism that would publish sanctioned IP addresses and domain name that could be subscribed to. And so, that this would be not just about, the Russian military, it sounds like, but also the, say, information warfare aspect, the information operations that is part of the broader effort. Is that right? And can you talk a little bit more about, kind of where we are in this debate, and if this is going to be a voluntary consensus-led effort, and you're always going to have some countries or organizations within certain geopolitical dynamics not signing on, does this do more potential harm than good?
You seem to be asking several unrelated questions there. So
okay, so let me. The first question is this idea of publishing the IP addresses and the domain names, et cetera. Is that targeted at Russia because of its information operations, or is that geared towards?
It's not targeted at Russia. It is a compliance mechanism with legally imposed sanctions. So network operators have a legal duty to obey the law in the country in which they are incorporated, and more generally in the countries in which they operate. Those governments supply the sanction list. It's not like something that somebody gets to make up. And so then the law says that you have to comply with that sanction. So one can go after that at its head and try and get, in the US, for instance, an OFAC license to not have to do it in the first place. But if one does not do that, or one is not successful at that, as reasonably one should not be much of the time, then one needs to comply with the law. So if one is complying with the law, then one wants that to be done as well and carefully as possible, and not involve over-compliance, because, as I said before, over-compliance appears to be the biggest problem here. So
I guess one of the things I'm not clear about, because you're saying, yes, of course, companies have a responsibility to comply with sanctions, and definitely in the country that they're incorporated in. But what this proposal is to create a multi-stakeholder mechanism that would, it sounded like from the proposal that it would come up with, through due process and consensus, this list of IP addresses and domain names. But then you're saying that it's going to be in relation to some government's decision about a list. So probably
no, all governments, right? All governments impose sanctions. So, you know, the Taliban just sanctioned Voice of America a few days ago, right? That's a sanction. It's a sanction against a propaganda outlet. I think, you know, if you surveyed Americans who know what it is, you'd get pretty much 100% consensus that Voice of America is a propaganda outlet, far more than, say, Al Jazeera, for instance. So, you know, sanctions are a tool that's used by essentially every government. There are fewer governments that have transnational network operators incorporated within their jurisdiction. So that's a thing. But, you know, fundamentally, everyone needs to obey the law. And if the law says that you need to sanction something and you can't get some exemption from that, then you need to comply. So then the question is, how accurately can you comply without violating human rights through overcompliance? So insofar as there's work to be done on the policy side rather than the implementation side, it's educating governments about any unintended over effects of things that they might be suggesting. There is the human shield problem that is a moral question that has to be addressed. And so there's feedback that can be provided from the policy community back to governments in the event that governments don't already know more about it than we do. But to my observation, governments know a lot more about this than anybody in the internet community that I've talked with so far.
Okay, fascinating. So, Farzaneh, I see you nodding. Do you want to weigh in on this quickly?
That's exactly, Bill is exactly right. Governments know and have imposed sanctions for a very long time. They know, and they have come up with ways to make sanctions more effective, more targeted. They come up with lists and special designated nationals. They come up with licenses. All these things happen. And, you know, but despite all this, and despite the government effort, like the US government, it doesn't even matter which administration, they want to sanction the rulemaker, the decision maker, but it has not been possible. And I don't know how we can, with a multi-stakeholder model or like some kind of like a consensus building, come up with like our own better, effective method while we are using exactly the same thing. We are using the list-based approach. We are using the operators and you know, we are using exactly the same thing. What is so different here that is going to make it more effective? And also, I just wanted to mention this. When we talk about boycotts, and I disagree with Andrew here about boycotts, like you have like Bill and Friends list, and that would not affect everybody. If we are hypothetically, if we are talking about consolidation of content of internet corporations and those that provide infrastructure, if you come up with a good boycott mechanism, you probably can affect the majority of traffic on the internet. And I want those who actually argue that internet consolidation exists and we need to monitor it to think about, even when you talk about private action and boycotts, how that can affect access when the government is not even involved. Thanks.
Thank you, Farzaneh. Yik-Chan, you wanted to get in on this as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated issue. So I think we need to make it a very clear distinction. What should not be touched. Public code should not be touched. What could be, using a sanction. For example, if there's we know the Paris Code. Paris Code is also against which used to tackle the terrorism. Maybe in that situation we can target for some special I don't know website or IP. But this has to be rested in some public authority which has not used. I think the global concern is that people use the internet infrastructure as a weapon, for the geopolitical reasons, not for really to trigger to anti-terrorism or even to save the children for some political risk. So that is a core concern. So what we need to really solve is there's a authority or central authority which can function to that extent. So I think this is the first issue. So if you ask my opinion, I think the UN right now, is working towards that. And should we support the UN, or we think there's other mechanism is better? But nonetheless, we have to face this reality. If there's no global institution, then each country, like the Clean Water Initiative by the US, or in the future, I don't know, maybe European Union will also have some initiative to, sanction other countries. So if that is what we were working towards, and then of course it's not good for everyone. So we need to have a final solution which has a coordination, which can be agreed by everyone. I think that this is the first issue I want to mention. We have, of course, we have some ideal, situation, but we have to face the political reality. There is a geopolitical going on at the moment. How can we overcome this geopolitical issue and without damage the internet's core public functions? And secondly, I think there's an issue towards the internet governance model. So we're talking the multi-stakeholder and also the polycenter multi-stakeholder, as many of you know that. What is a polycenter governance, which means we have different sector, for example, the technical community, transnational technical community, or the academics, or the business sector, or the government sector to do the different decentralized governance model. So that's the issue about transparency and accountability of that. So, I mean, it's legitimate for the technical community, transnational technical community to govern the internet, but there's a transparency and the accountability issue about that. So we need to address this issue as well. Like if Bill wants to build up a polycentric mechanism, then we have to face the legitimacy, transparency, and accountability issue.
An excellent point, Yik-Chan. I think those are some fundamental principles that are built into the way that internet policy making ideally should get done. And I would also bring in here a note from Peter Mychek that the idea of sanctions development process to date contradicts the inclusive horizontal governance models that many in the internet governance and especially ISOC community champion. But Andrew, I wanted to go to you because something that Bill said struck me. I spent a lot of time working as a journalist and an academic in the Middle East, and seeing firsthand, for example, how certain domestic opposition groups are labeled as terrorists and then potentially put on sanctions list. And it sounds like, that if the Taliban decides to sanction all women's rights groups, then they would be applicable to be sanctioned in the same way because they are a government and therefore sanctions could be legitimized. This is problematic from my perspective, but I think more broadly, there is this vision that the internet could be something beyond or different than national sovereign boundaries. And I think you kind of alluded to this before, that it's not supposed to be about national boundaries. Of course, we all know there is a big element of that in there. And I'd like to hear your reaction to this idea that each government should have its own sanctions list, and then that would then be implemented in that country. But then secondly, is this whole debate and what's happening around Russia going to further efforts towards a splinter net? And is that kind of the direction we're inevitably heading? Andrew?
So certainly that is the direction that I worry we're heading, and it's part of the reason I've been pretty vocal about this topic, because I think it's quite dangerous to start suggesting that groups of countries should get together and kick other countries off the internet, which is essentially what we've talked about, or maybe subsets of the networks in those countries or something. The details to be worked out is usually what I get in response to my overstating of the case. So the fundamental problem is that the internet, because it's made up of different networks, and because some of those networks can be international in character, it's just not designed to, around country gateways. We could have built that. Like, that was an alternative path that was open. In fact, it was one of the proposals. That's what the Catanet was supposed to be. You had these clear gateways, and they lived at the edges of countries. And when you crossed that gateway, that was the place that would tell you whether this traffic was allowed or what all at the international border. We didn't build that. And I think we benefited from the fact that we didn't build it, because I think several of those gateways would have pretty naturally ended up being in the hands of monopolies who didn't really like the idea that somebody was going to come along and break their monopoly. So I think the choice that we made was the right one. But having made that choice, sometimes I think that people think that because you've invented something, it is infinitely plastic and you can change it in any way you like. But that isn't true. Technologies shape the world that they come into. The automobile has irredeemably changed the way the world is, and we can't just make it go away. It's not a thing that can be undone. The internet and its communication style establishes certain facts about how this communication can work. And one of them is that there isn't a border post at the edge of the country's networks. There just isn't. And if we want to make that happen, what will happen, of course, is that those networks will fracture. And the very next thing will happen is that we will break the world and its networks into different clubs that, maybe interact with each other in some way, maybe through the ITU or maybe some other mechanism, or maybe they don't. I am old enough to remember growing up in a world where it was extraordinarily difficult to make international long distance calls because it was a complicated thing that had to be negotiated country by country. And the sort of closer culturally that country was to you, maybe it was a little bit easier. Well, I don't think that we should go back to that. And I think that it's a mistake in human development to try to revert to that mode of operation. But we could do it. And if we did, I believe it would be bad for all of humanity. I don't think we should do it.
Andrew, you're arguing the intersection of two straw men. You're talking about kicking countries off the internet. The only people who suggested kicking any country off the internet was the Ukrainian government. And the entire purpose of the letter was to explain why that wasn't going to happen, why that was a bad idea. The thing that governments are suggesting are sanctions against specific entities. So let's take a particular example. So we've got the triumvirate of the Internet Research Agency, Wagner, and the guy who owns both of them. Those three are sanctioned entities. Okay. The sanction, if it's imposed via the internet, means blocking their domain names and IP addresses through networks that participate by dint of being incorporated in countries that have passed that sanction, which includes, for instance, the EU, Norway, Switzerland, Canada, US, Australia, a few others. Okay. This doesn't kick them off the internet by any means. It removes some of the societal subsidies that decrease their costs. So cooperation is an efficiency. When we all work together, we all benefit. But in order to work together as a society, we all have to share some common values. If somebody violates those common values by going and killing a lot of people in another country, they're not part of our society. They don't get to partake of the efficiencies that we gain through cooperation. So we remove that cooperation from them, we stop subsidizing them, their costs go up. They're not kicked off the internet. We just don't subsidize them anymore. So this is compliance with law, and it's removal of a societal subsidy to people who violate societal norms. It's not kicking countries off the internet.
Very well, but in that case, the point that I've been trying to make, and I've tried to make a couple of times, is that what it fundamentally does is moves costs onto these individuals. I agree with that. And right. So
people who buy billion-dollar yachts.
Yeah, I get it. You drive up those costs. Andrew. You drive up those costs, but because those are the people who are the most powerful in that society, what they will do is seize the assets of somebody else that you haven't sanctioned yet. And like this is a war of or an arms race that you cannot win.
Okay, I want to go to Yik-Chan, who wanted to get in on this point. Go ahead, Yik.
Yeah, I think we're going to the circle again, because Bill just says there's a different value. Then it's come to the value issue again, So, for example, I think many of our colleagues already argued whether we should treat, the RT as a propaganda agents, or should we treat the Voice of America as a propaganda, So all this become a geopolitical issue and ideology conflict. So in that sense, so it's really, I think we need a mechanism to solve this. I'm not personally 100% against, say we should, if there's a political side, sort of pornography site, or there's a terrorism site, or we should block the site, or that sense. But if involved anything about propaganda, ideology, and for political reason, we have to be very careful, and where should ultimately power of judgment rest? And we need a kind of coordination and or central agreement mechanism, which is beyond the national border, even beyond the European level, So that is the very issue we needed to tackle it.
So we are getting up to time, and I think this has been a really fascinating and interesting debate. Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I guess I would like to hear from each of the panelists before we wrap up. Where do we go from here? What is the natural next step to addressing, I think what a lot of people have very rightly seen as a very aggressive invasion, illegal under international law, that needs a proportional response. We've seen how important Russian information operations are to both their warfare now, but also the lead up to that. And frankly, how that has become integrated into many countries' approaches to geopolitical warfare and influence operations. But at the same time, we're talking about something deeper than the content level, but somehow this is all related, as well as through the availability of the basic internet infrastructure to communicate, which will affect militaries, but also individual people. So we have this proposal out there. We have a very, large range of perspectives on this. So from your perspective, what should the next steps be? So let me start now. Yik-Chan, why don't we start with you? What should the next steps be here?
I think there's two, which I think is feasible. First of all, we know there's a debate within the OEWG, even it's not binding, what they propose is not binding. But I think the OEWG should work out, define what is a public call, and to go ahead, because the last report, they originally want to include the definition of public call in their final report, but it didn't happen. So I think at that level, and the UN level and the OEWG or some global institution level, we should reach agreement to protect the public call, and of course, which part should include to be the public call is subject to negotiation but there are already many organizations proposed, substance of public court. This is one thing I think we should further go ahead. Then we should definitely protect the integrity of public core, and as a global resource, nobody should sanction toward that. And secondly, I think in terms of content, we're really should be concerned about the big company, the social media's power, like a Facebook or Twitter. They impose all these sanctions without a kind of the legal restriction, especially if they're based in America, and because the sections 230, and also the extrajudicial issues. If the content which is not validated the law in one country, should this be allowed in other countries? So this is a two crucial issue: the power of the social media and the content, censorship, and the public core issue.
Okay, so it sounds like that your two next steps would be addressing the power of social media platforms. That's more on the content level, and then coming up with a consensus definition of public core. Bill, next over to you. What are the next steps from your perspective?
Really, I think this is just all about education at this point. We've got people in government who need to understand better what the capabilities of internet network management are, so that they don't ask for things that are inherently human rights violating or are broader than necessary. And on the private sector side, make sure that people look and see what the sanctions actually are and work towards a shared implementation so that they're not each faced with an insurmountable implementation barrier that leads them to over-implement.
Great, thank you, Bill. So next steps are read the actual sanctions, educate about how these things work, and figure out how to essentially implement them. Andrew, over to you. Next steps from your perspective.
Well, I agree with Bill that we actually need to educate people about the consequences of some of the things that they're asking. This is the reason that the Internet Society has worked over the last couple of years to develop this Internet Impact Assessment toolkit. Rather like environmental assessments when you're building a dam, you should do Internet Impact Assessments when you're building a dam on the Internet. And so the fundamental idea is that you need to understand what the consequences of this are. And I think that is one of the critical parts, because I think that, on the technical community side, we do need to get sort of realistic. We maybe need some political education about the way sanctions regimes work in practice, as opposed to merely the letter of the law. I agree with Bill that frequently there are there's a lot of over compliance, but I also think that that's part of the design of the system.
Thank you, Andrew. So it sounds like impact assessments and figuring out both the impact assessments, but also then looking at the actual impact of sanctions regimes and how the theory differs from the reality on the ground. Farzaneh, I'm giving you the last word. What should be next from your perspective?
I think that the longer term demilitarization of the internet is an ideal, and internet should not be weaponized, and we should work on that. That, however, is not going to be answered by sanctions. We need to work on more interconnectivity and keep the interoperable global internet intact by not introducing, again, another set of discriminatory practices into internet infrastructure, but help countries that struggles, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and other countries that are in war and conflict, to be able to be connected, to defend themselves, and to connect to the global internet, and defend themselves also from the atrocity that like in case of Afghanistan and Iran, the government of those countries are actually imposing on them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzaneh. This has been a really, really interesting and informative debate. And I want to just also thank the participants who have been having a robust conversation in the chat. And I'm hoping my colleague will be able to capture that chat, and we'll think about a way to incorporate some of that perhaps in the transcript for this call. This is obviously not an easy discussion to have when there are such a range of perspectives, which is actually great because I feel like a lot of times we have discussions among ourselves where we're all saying the same thing. So I want to thank everyone for, their respectful, thoughtful, and impassioned perspective on these topics. This is certainly the beginning, not the end of this conversation. I want to, this panel came about because there is a robust discussion on, I don't know which listserv it was, but, just saying, hey, we want to get these experts together to help inform the debate. And that's how this came about. So, this event was sponsored by many organizations. I want to especially recognize GigaNet, where Yik-Chan and I think Farzaneh, you're in GigaNet, and I was the former outreach chair. We've got Niels ten Over, who is now the chair there. It is a really important academic network of internet governance scholars. I want to thank everyone and all of the organizations who helped put this event together, and especially my colleague Lex for getting up very early at the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy to get this up and running. I invite everyone to stay engaged on this topic. We shared a lot of resources here, and we appreciate everyone's perspective. So please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our panelists. And until next time, thank you.
Recording stopped.